And our first speaker is Wyatt Carlton. I think I took my glasses off. From one of our sponsors, and he'll be talking about carbon markets and biochar. You ready?
Good morning. How's everyone doing? Awesome. Yeah, is the slide deck is queued up on these now? There you go. Perfect. I'm Wyatt Catron. This is my colleague, Serene. Serene will introduce herself too when she gets up here. We are both from a company called 3 Degrees. 3 Degrees is an environmental commodities company that's been around for 15 years. We've worked a lot in the dairy space, voluntary carbon markets. Today we're here to talk about biochar and the carbon markets and some of what we've seen, where we hope it goes, some of the opportunities for carbon credits for biochar end uses. We'll talk a little bit about that. Here's just kind of an overview of our company. There's about 300 of us all across the world. Our biggest presence is in North America and Europe. We've got employees all over. I am in Montana. That's where I come from today. Our company's primary office is, though, just over in San Francisco, right over here. And I'm a project development manager. My role at 3 Degrees is to find projects. I work with biochar projects. I work with cattle projects, ranches, all sorts of different project types, and we help bring them access to carbon markets.
Hi, everyone. Is this working? Hi, everyone. I'm Serene. I'm also part of 3 Degrees. I'm an associate on our project operations team, so I'm dealing a lot with the monitoring, reporting, and verification of projects to various registries. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that today as well, but that's me. You'll hear from me. Back to Wyatt.
Cool. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I always like to share some of the fun facts about biochar in history and some of the terminology that has been used to talk about using different forms of carbon through pyrolysis systems, through just using carbon as ash, and how that's been used in the past. My favorite term is the ash manure, which I'll talk about a little bit later. This idea of biochar composting and mixing biochar in with other organics to make it a better soil amendment, but also to make it less, obviously back in ancient Korea and Japan, there wasn't thought process around mixing in the char into the compost to reduce emissions. It was purely from an agricultural perspective, but now it's really exciting to see that, come back to circle and see the emissions benefits that can be associated with it. Oh. It's just because that. Perfect. I'll go back one. There we go. Yeah, and I think one of my favorites, if you've ever read some of these articles or seen some of these videos, this slide deck I'll make available to anyone who wants it. I put the links in there so you can go check out. These are some of my favorite ones to read about. I particularly like this article, The Kilns of Kishu and the Making of Biochar Charcoal, and it's a great article that really kind of dives into the history, how it was used, the different types of the evolution of different kilns in ancient times. It's a really cool article to check out. I'm going to hand things off to Serene to start talking about some of the basics around carbon credits and what that means for biochar.
Okay. Okay, so really going to get into the basics here right now. What is a carbon credit? A carbon credit is basically created when 1 metric ton of carbon is either avoided, reduced, or removed from the atmosphere. And in the case of biochar, a carbon credit is created when biomass is converted into biochar and then used in some way to preserve its carbon storage. Something that we really want to note here is this little bubble on the left-hand side there, kind of differentiating between an inset and an offset. So a carbon credit can either be transacted as an offset or an inset. When a carbon credit is used to mitigate a company's Scope 3 emissions, that is considered an offset, but when it's used to mitigate Scope 1 emissions, so within a company's supply chain, that is considered an inset. Okay. So if we just take a step back for a second, there's a bunch of different, activities that can happen to reduce, avoid, or remove emissions, and therefore that can generate carbon credits. We've just laid out a bunch of different project types here just to show the diversity of the types of projects that exist out there, and they kind of fall on this various parts of the matrix. It's a good way to visualize what's happening in the carbon markets. So if we look at the y-axis, we can see a range of technology-based solutions to nature-based solutions, and then on the x-axis we can see a range of reduction and avoidance all the way to kind of removal project types. And you can see biochar just in blue, like on the very left side. It leans towards a removal project type because it creates a carbon sink with a permanence of approximately 100 years or more. I know we're talking about like the 1,000-year kind of time frame here. But it also falls somewhere between kind of nature and technology-based solution. Again, this is like all subjective, but just kind of a way to help us visualize the various types of carbon projects that exist and how biochar fits within that space. Okay, so now that we've identified that there's a bunch of different project types that exist out there, let's now all talk about the important things to consider with all carbon projects. The first thing I really want to highlight here is the concept of additionality. That's the first row, which is basically the idea that a project wouldn't have otherwise occurred if it were not for carbon revenue. There's a variety of ways to prove this, and I'll talk about it in the next few slides. But again, other important things to consider are, GHG accounting. How are you actually quantifying emissions reductions? How are you doing these calculations? Project monitoring, permanence, co-benefits, and project participants. So, who's claiming these credits? Who's benefiting from the sale of these credits? All of these things are really important. Okay. So next, in order to actually generate credits, a project does need to be listed on a registry in order to generate carbon credits. And in the case of biochar, these three registries here, Verra, the Climate Action Reserve, or CAR, and Puro all have their own biochar methodologies. And a methodology is basically just a set of guidelines that a project needs to follow and a set of equations in order to quantify the actual carbon sequestered into biochar. Okay, now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on what these guidelines and these equations typically look like. Oh. Okay, there. So first, as I mentioned before, every biochar project needs to demonstrate additionality, which is again showing that the project wouldn't have otherwise occurred without carbon revenue. And typically a combination of any of these three ways is required. So first is the project automatically meets the requirements set forth by the methodology or registry and therefore automatically passes this test. Second is that it's not required by any existing laws. Actually, all projects need to follow this because otherwise it doesn't really make sense for a carbon project to exist if it's already required by law. And then the third is that it needs to complete kind of a financial or an investment analysis to show how it requires financing from the carbon markets. Okay, next, a biochar project needs to meet all the applicability requirements set forth by a certain methodology. It can't just be kind of like a random facility that wants to generate credits. It does need to meet certain requirements. And there's a bunch, but I kind of wanted to lay out some important ones that I was seeing when I was reviewing these methodologies. For instance, there's considerations like, can the feedstock be purpose grown or does it need to be waste only? Again, the biochar needs to be used in a way that preserves its carbon storage, or it just defeats the purpose entirely. If you're combusting the biochar, then you're releasing the carbon back into the atmosphere, and it's not really doing any good. Usually, the biochar needs to meet certain quality standards from either the IBI or EBC. Location also matters. Some methodologies don't allow for international projects, for instance. The the biochar facility also needs to be relatively new because, if you're already producing char for a while, then it's not really considered additional. It doesn't really seem like you needed the carbon revenue to get the project started. Again, there's a lot more considerations to take into consideration, but these are just some high-level examples that. Good. Okay. Now on to some calculations. How is the project actually quantifying its carbon removals? This is typically done by calculating first the carbon sequestered by the project and then subtracting what we call project emissions, which is emissions that the project generated via facility operations, running the pyrolysis reactor, or distribution of biochar, transporting it in some way. So all of those things need to be considered. The carbon sequestered by the project is calculated differently in each methodology, but these are some of the common variables I've listed out here that are in all of the methodologies. So, quantity of biochar produced, the permanence or stability of the biochar, that's calculated in various different ways, and the organic carbon content of the biochar, typically via lab analysis. Okay, so as I mentioned, the 3 different methodologies, there are, similarities between all of them. All of them are trying to accurately, quantify carbon removals and the benefits of biochar, but there are differences between them, and some kind of big differences that I've seen is that, CAR and Puro only allow for purpose-grown feedstock, whereas Vera only allows for waste byproducts to be used. Vera and Puro assumes soil end use in their calculations, which is interesting, and CAR does not, meaning that CAR allows you to use different permanence factors depending on the end use. And lastly, the stability or permanence of carbon is calculated in a different way for each of the methodologies. Vera depends on pyrolysis temperature, so typically the higher the temperature, the more stable the biochar that they consider. Puro depends on soil temperature at your end use, so location of where you're applying your biochar matters. And CAR provides default values for virtually any end use. So these are just kind of highlights, but there's, many more differences and many more similarities, but just kind of giving an overview of what we've seen with these existing methodologies. They're still evolving, but passing it back to Wyatt.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk. Oh, now I turned it off. I took it out. Is it working? There we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the one thing everyone always seems to want to talk about, right? Which, rightly so. What's the value of biochar? What's the pricing of biochar? How do I go into a carbon market with any kind of idea on what I'm going to do? And many of you have asked me this question. I've talked to a lot of you in this room, and you've probably heard my same answer, which is if I knew the exact future and the prices of carbon, I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd be on a beach somewhere. I'd be relaxing, kicked back in a hammock with a drink in my hand. So I just, I think for starters, it's always important to step out and recognize that there is price changes in carbon markets. They're not the commodities in the same way that we might be used to with fixed pricing. However, there are opportunities to do that in carbon markets. I show here the Puro Cork Carbon Removal Index. This is really the first index we've had for biochar pricing, which is really cool. It's a tracking of what biochar credits are transacting at. There's some big variables that go into play here to determine this number. One of the things I want to put out there about the Puro Index is that it is global, so it is looking at biochar projects from all over the world. In our experience as a carbon retailer, 3 Degrees in the last 2 years has sold in the 700 to 800 million carbon credit range. We've transacted that with our buyers, and we notice preferences. Geography preferences are a big thing. Biochar, there haven't been a lot of biochar opportunities in North America for credit buyers to look at. So when looking at this Puro Index and that number, keep in mind that there is some of that variability. I show that in one of the bullet points there. I was looking at the highs and the lows of everything that transacted last year on the market, and I found the lowest transactions near the $80 price point and a few transactions near that $525 price point for really small, really specific projects that were of really specific interest to a particular buyer. I think that's one really important thing, right, is that not all carbon credits are the same. A big portion of a carbon credit and how it behaves and sells in the market is the story behind it, the belief that it's additional, the agreement behind the science of how the carbon is being stored and processed. Sustainability of a feedstock is also a really important thing. There's been recent guidance, and I'll talk about that on my next slide, coming out of the private sector saying, hey, these are the things we're looking for if we're going to buy carbon removals from a biochar project. This is what we want to see. And the last thing, just a great number to have on hand. I apologize for the typo, but on average, we see that 1 ton of biochar can produce about 1.5 to 3 carbon removals credits. It depends on a lot of things, as Serene showed you those calculations before. The carbon content, which is heavily dependent on the feedstock and the pyrolysis process for the permanence, all play a role in determining whether your ton of biochar is worth 1.5 metric tons of carbon removals or worth 3 metric tons of carbon removals. Some of the considerations that buyers have really circle around the sustainability of the feedstock and the sustainability of the end use. I listed just some of the popular certifications that buyers will ask about when they're looking at buying from biochar projects. These are probably the most common ones. They're featured in a lot of recommendations. Again, this slide deck is also meant to be a resource, so I left these here linked with the links to the certifications and the processes of how they're obtained. I pulled an excerpt from Carbon Direct, is a company that's done a lot of work with Microsoft and who's, as we all know, a big buyer in the carbon markets, someone who purchases a lot of carbon removals types credits, and their, key principles about what makes a biochar project or any kind of biomass project appealing and the kinds of things that they think about. So that's important whenever we're talking about a biochar project, is to know, buyers are going to be interested in, carbon market buyers are going to be interested in knowing what is the upstream impact, what are the social impacts, what are the community impacts of a biochar project, and that all goes into kind of determining what the value is for a biochar project. And then lastly, I just want to talk about some of the additional credit opportunities and paths to work with food and beverage companies, paths to work with cement and concrete companies. I'll let Serene kind of talk about the concrete first, and then I'll jump here and talk about some of the manure management programs where we see a cool future for biochar.
Okay, so right, so the biochar methodologies I just reviewed and compared earlier credits, the production of biochar itself and how it sequesters carbon, but because, as we know, biochar has so many co-benefits, when biochar is applied at various end uses, it can further reduce or avoid emissions in other spaces and therefore generate more credits. So one of the ways that it can do this is if it follows the low carbon cement protocol under the Climate Action Reserve protocol methodology, same term. So this other methodology under CAR. And basically what happens is biochar can be incorporated into concrete, which results in less Portland cement needed to produce concrete. And Portland cement is extremely emissions intensive in the concrete production process. And so if you bring biochar in to displace that avoids emissions from Portland cement, and that would have otherwise happened. And so you can generate credits from that.
Thanks, Serene. I'm going to steal your laptop because mine lied to me. It said it had 45 minutes of power left, and it had about 6. So the alternative manure management programs is something that 3 Degrees has been doing a lot of work in lately. We've done things with vermifiltration, with different kind of chemical flocculant treatments. So this is a way to treat manure from particularly dairy without the use of like a digester system or producing RNG. So it works really well for small to medium-sized facilities where building that kind of infrastructure doesn't always pencil out. Biochar presents a really unique opportunity. I'm not going to talk too much about biochar as a feedstock, as solids, organic solids like manure as a feedstock for biochar. But actually on the downstream, there's potential ways to generate credits for biochar as an end use going into manure compost, filtration of flush fluids coming out of manure systems, and the associated methane and nitrous oxides and other things that you can get when you use biochar in the agricultural space. There's a study published in the Environmental Journal of Science and Technology in 2022. I've got that study linked down here that shows that by composting with a biochar amendment in manure blends, you can get up to an 89% reduction in methane emissions from that, which is creditable activity under the alternative manure management protocol on Vera. And, just kind of some numbers I like to throw out there. We think that per cow, you can get about 4 credits from doing this kind of thing when you amend it with biochar as compared to the 1 or 2 that you get when you just do a regular composting process. So we're excited to see more research be done here, and hopefully we can help bring carbon credit financing and marketplaces to help some of that research happen and go further. Biochar also drastically accelerates the composting rate, and so it makes composting a more viable option for dairies that have a high high production rate of manure. Composting generally takes a longer time, and biochar can be used to accelerate that. It also, the other thing that can be done is that biochar can be used as a fertilizer mixed in, and there's some new crediting mechanisms evolving in the voluntary markets to allow counting nitrogen reductions, so nitrous oxide emissions reductions that are associated with amendments to fertilizers. We think that's a really promising track for biochar. This is especially true in the food and beverage industry, where we're seeing a lot of interest from dairy companies, other like candy companies, any food and beverage company really who are looking to limit their scope 3 emissions. They're interested in creative ways to reduce emissions in their supply chain, and we think biochar has a lot of really cool, promising opportunities for that. And with that, that's all. Thank you.
We do have time for a few questions. I'll just ask you if you could stand up and introduce yourself and speak loudly.
I was just wondering, you said manure management works best in small and medium-sized kind of operations.
Yeah.
How do you make the project size? Seems like that would be difficult to get off, because if it works in small, then it's expensive to get project going.
Yeah, the nice part about some of the alternative manure management treatments is that the pricing for the technology is pretty scalable to the size of the farm, versus there's a pretty high price floor for building a digester, and it takes a pretty big operation to support that, versus an operation of around 1,000 or under 1,000 head of cows can realistically look at some of these alternative treatments where there is lower infrastructure costs to do that, and then carbon revenue can play a good incentive program in allowing those changes to happen.
Elaine O'Neill with the Washington Farm Forestry Association. Can we go back one slide? I have a question on this slide too, but on this particular slide, you have there on the bullet point number 3 or 4 that your biomass can be produced without threatening protected areas or reducing original carbon stock. I see that as a real problem here in the West because we have too many trees, and that's one of the reasons they're dying and burning. So is there something in there that can sort of provide sort of a subset, except for in those places where we have way too many trees?
Yeah, I'm gonna switch back here. Sorry, the computer is hitting the button. Yeah, so this is kind of general guidelines. It's very situationally specific. Really, the idea is the net effect and the net change positive? These are concerns written by another organization that was supported by a couple really big buyers in the carbon markets. And the idea is to really look upstream on the effect. I've seen personally from buyers high interest in projects that their biomass sourcing is from reducing carbon and minimizing fire risk in certain areas. I've seen that been popular among buyers, saying like, hey, I would be interested in projects that got their feedstock from that. So I don't think that's a barrier. I think the consideration here is more just thinking about, clear cutting for the sake of making biochar. No one wants people out there cutting down a bunch of trees and stuff that should be there just because there's an incentive to make carbon credits.
So are they measuring that? Are they accounting for whatever the displacement value of and this ties back into the next question, which is about the concrete example you have, is it seems to me that there's some low-hanging fruit here that maybe hasn't been touched on, is this idea that they're interested in supporting the idea of reducing density to avoid fire. Are they measuring and giving credit for the avoided fire, or is it just some soft, mushy thing?
No, it's so this requirement here is, again, as Wyatt said, just to avoid that, active clear cutting in order to make biochar. So all of the methodologies do recognize the excess of, biomass in certain places, like you mentioned, and so they actually don't require these sort of sustainability certifications in a lot of cases anymore because it's irrelevant. But that stipulation is there just to kind of prevent that clear cutting option, and there's no additional benefit for these for what you mentioned.
Yeah, you don't get a quantifiable credit in your carbon for the potential avoided fire, at least under any current methodology that I've seen. Yep.
Biochar.org appreciates the support of our sponsors, exhibitors, presenters, and attendees. We look forward to seeing you at our next conference in September 2025.